My name is Tania Munz, and I'm the president and CEO of the Forest History Society. We're based in Durham, North Carolina, in the United States. I'm one of the hosts of this series, and I'll be introducing today's webinar. Quick introduction of my co-hosts. Professor Mark Ashton in the middle of this slide. Mark is the Morris K. Jessup Professor of Silviculture and Forest Ecology and the Director of the Yale Forests. And then to the right of the slide, you have Gary Dunning. Gary's the Executive Director of the Forest School and the Forest Dialogue, both based at the Yale School of the Environment, also New Haven, Connecticut in the US. Gary and I are going to be trading off facilitation duties for this series. As you know, the YFF webinar series this term has focused on the history of people, forests, and forestry. Now we're over halfway through the series, and you can see we still have a few very excellent speakers lined up in the coming weeks. Please note that there was a change to our schedule for the April 3rd presentation, and you can see the final schedule on this slide and also on our website. A quick reminder on the series logistics. This series convenes most Thursdays from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern U.S. time through early April. And each webinar runs for roughly 30 minutes, and then we have time for Q&A by audience members. Please remember to submit your questions into the Zoom Q&A function, so not into the chat, but if you can do the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of the screen, that helps us a lot. Each session in this series is also recorded, and it will be available on the Yale Forest Forum's website shortly after the session. If you have any questions related to this series, please email us at yff@yale.edu. And now I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker, Bill Tripp. Bill is the Director of Natural Resources and Environmental Policy for the Karuk Tribe and the Department of Natural Resources, KDNR for short. Bill started burning with his tribal elders when he was 4 years old. The lessons he learned in that time inspired him to dedicate his life's work to helping bring fire back to the people. In addition to leading the KDNR, Bill holds many leadership positions, including as a co-lead of the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership, as an advisor to the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, and a co-chair of the Western Region Strategy Committee. He's also the speaker of the board for the Indigenous Stewardship Network and chair of the Intertribal Timber Council's Fire Subcommittee. As a cultural fire practitioner, Bill works diligently to revitalize Indigenous fire cultures. We're really excited to have you with us today, Bill. Thank you for joining us. And there he is. Hi, Bill.
For having me.
Our session today, just to give a little bit of an overview, is going to be organized like the first session that we did in the series as a conversation. And Bill and I are going to spend the first part of the session talking. I'll ask him questions and we'll have a conversation. And then afterwards, we'll invite the audience in to ask their questions. And Gary's going to come on and facilitate the Q&A. Before we get started, today's session is called Karuk Forest and Fire Management, a conversation with Bill Tripp. Great. Bill, thank you so much. So as I noted in your bio, you were introduced to fire when you were a very young child. I wanted to get us started. If you could talk to us a little bit about how you grew up learning about the uses of fire as a cultural practice and how you learned about fire from your family and others as both a tool and also a way of life. Can you tell us about that, Bill?
Yeah. When I was about 4 years old, I was trying to build a fire in the stove, waiting for my great grandmother to wake up, and she came out when she heard me messing with the wood stove, and told me that if I was going to be playing with fire, then I was going to do something good with it. And so she took me out underneath of the oak trees and gave me a box of matches and said, burn a line from here to here. It's only, a couple meters maybe. And so I tried to do that. I noticed quickly that I was about a quarter of the way there and about halfway through my matches, and I realized that what I was doing wasn't necessarily working. And so, I focused on, rearranging the fuels. Only the very top layer of the leaves were dry, and not all of them were dry enough to even burn. So I had to rearrange them. I had to play with how the fire behaved with the fuels by lighting it different ways, and and ultimately I ended up getting there. I used every last match, but I did it. And when I went to get her to come take a look, she said, "Okay, I'll tell you the stories." And so, I consider myself very fortunate that I passed her test that day, because it ultimately ended up being one of the most important moments of my life, when I really reflect on things. And so she started telling me three stories a day, and so, and then we all really were just got out there and we're burning in all those right times. She started having the whole family get out there and start taking care of that stuff. That was, it was her sister's responsibility. She spent 30 years of her life walking up down ridges, picking up firewood, and bringing it home for the village, where her sister spent, 30 years of her life, burning the hazel, for the village. And so, so she taught me the pieces that she knew about that, but all that information is contained in those stories of all the animals, and how the animals' responsibilities, and the human emotion behind things, and the emotion behind, the animals' behaviors. And so, those things just end up giving you, lifelong cues. And sometimes those stories would be told, three times, and at the end of every time, it's like, what does this story mean? Would be the question asked, and so the answer would always lead to which story came next, or if the story had to be told again with slight change, just to facilitate understanding. A lot of times we're told things today that isn't necessarily the way humans learn. And so, humans actually have to come to understanding, before moving on, or else they really aren't learning anything. And so yeah, that's basically the process that I went through until I was about 8 years old. And by then, I had enough experience, in burning, especially in that February, March, late winter dormant season, time period, to where I was, the family felt comfortable with just, those kids out there burning and coming in and getting the adults if there was, any need for help, which, we never did need it. So.
Thank you for that. It's amazing, right? Just when kids are curious about fire, to not tell them not to burn things, but to really bring them into the cultural heritage of burning. It's really lovely. So this is how you were taught about fire by your great grandmother and her sister, really your elders. I'm wondering, your people have been on the land in Northern California for millennia and have been working with fire. Can you talk to us a little bit about what we know about your ancestors and how they worked the land and how they worked with fire and how they managed forests before European settlers came and waged genocide against indigenous people? What do we know about that deeper history?
Well, it's contained in the oral, transmission of our stories and our ceremonial practices. Our world renewal ceremonies, and not just those, but even like our flower dance and, others, are, have that information contained in them. They're a reminder of how, we're supposed to be. and what we're supposed to be doing, and what we're supposed to keep an eye on. And so, that type of an approach allows for adaptation with time, through time and change. Whereas when, there's a finite, this is how it is done and this is how it always should be done, approach, that's flawed. Maybe you do it one way when you're coming out of an ice age, and you do it another way when you're experiencing a lot of global heating. But the principles of care for the land and the environment, and upholding the responsibility to the animals is foundational. And so, there's things that tell us about, why we need to be burning Off-Field Mountain on the new moon in September as part of our world renewal ceremonies. That creates, smoke. It creates changes to the water profile. It changes water temperature. It changes, all of these different things at a level that helps give salmon an extra boost, a little bit of extra earlier run time, and so kind of sometimes can make the difference between that stressful and survivable kind of thing going from refugia to refugia. And so we, with these practices, we were able to, sustain a summer run of salmon, which we don't have anymore. So there's just a whole lot of those things. I mean, I could probably talk for hours just on pieces that we currently know about, the types of vegetation deer and elk like to eat and have more nutrients, and how that relates to how we can catch more fish by burning the live oak, and then cutting the live oak down that's got the dry pokey leaves, and using that to help enhance our catch of eels, and while at the same time enhancing the materials and cordage we use to make nets, and then coming around years later and using that same live oak resource to have a wider opening in our dip nets when and enhancing the success of our catch. So it's all of these things are interrelated and connected together. And we didn't have chainsaws. We had fire, and we had burden baskets, and a lot of small wood that can be broken up and carried. Was never on the forest floor, at least on these main ridge systems. And so yeah, there's definitely a whole lot to it.
And just, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm really struck by how there's such an understanding of the interconnections to the different ecological factors on the land. And I think, I think Western science has been much more narrow and much more reductive, and sort of privileged knowledge that really isolated one thing and then would manipulate that. And what I hear from you is so much more kind of interconnected. I looked at a recent study that was published in the Ecological Society of America's journal Ecological Applications by Skye Greenler and colleagues, and yourself. You're a co-author on that study. And this work focused on pre-colonial fire practices within the Karuk Aboriginal territory in Northern California, so your land. And the authors write, quote, "While there is increasing recognition of Indigenous fire stewardship among Western scientists and managers, the extent and purpose of culture burning is generally absent from the landscape fire modeling literature and our understanding of ecosystem processes and development," end quote. They found the culture burning was extensive. This is probably wasn't news to you, but they found that there were about 7,000 annual ignitions. And they also found, and here's another quote from the paper, This work demonstrates the importance of cultural burning for developing and maintaining the ecosystems present at the time of colonization and underscores the need to work collaboratively with Indigenous communities to restore ecological processes in these systems. Can you tell us a bit more about your participation in this work as a knowledge holder and the significance of this kind of study?
Yeah, I mean, another thing that study found was that the research that had come together to compile the what is now considered the fire regime, historic fire regime. It didn't consider the human influences, and it didn't, and so it threw out the data where only one, fire scar was found, and so in a fire year, and so that skewed that fire regime to be a lot longer, and
Mm-hmm.
and even then, some of them were quite short. But you just you just change that math a little bit, and your regime shortens significantly. We're talking in a lot of cases about fires that may not even make scars, and so it's some of the burning in the that I've done is at such kind of low intensity and just taking off the top layer of the duff, that you wouldn't even create a scar in an established tree. It wouldn't even get into really a cat face dead wood and do that in some years. And so that's one of the things that we found. And so that was kind of my role in participation in that study, was to use my knowledge and experience from my history and bring that into the conversation. And so and that estimate of 7,000 ignitions that were cultural ignitions is really a modest estimate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you look at over 120 villages in our Karuk Aboriginal territory, and even if 5 people only burned in each village for 2 weeks at a time, 3 times a year, which would be a low amount of burning. I mean, that's easy to do today, and in the conditions that we're in today, and you end up with a really big number. So we really did, in my belief, underestimate that number, because we did, but these, and so because there's other ignitions that were pretty good scale burns that would happen in the higher country, and with ceremonies, but they would be on an annual regime. And so some of those annual regimes, like the World Renewal ceremonies for Off-Field and Black Mountain, you know, those ones would actually need a northeast wind event in order to really be dry enough to carry fire, and so we were burning at the hottest, driest portions of the year for these things, and just right above places where people had permanent full-time wooden homes. And so the so yeah, it was just my you know that's just the that was kind of my part in it, was to bring those kind of factors into the dialogue. And
What was it like to collaborate with this team where they're doing modeling, they're using maps, they're using written sources, and they're talking to people like you? What was it like to have that kind of a collaboration for this study?
it was, I mean, it was fun and interesting. It's always a challenge to really get down to what you should and shouldn't bring into that kind of a study. There are some things that are, of a ceremonial nature that are really not for the public. It's like in Karuk culture, it's it's supposed to be only for those that walk before, And so, when you're someone like a couple of folks in that study had served in the capacity of a Fatawena in ceremony, and so sometimes it can be kind of hard to remember where you're supposed to like draw that line. But we did our best, and we did our best to try not to like tell actual stories because those are only supposed to be um, you know, told in the winter when the snow's flying, and so the holding true to the ceremonial principles and standards was probably the biggest challenge. But ultimately, I think that the outcome of getting something out there on the record under that Western science framework is something that is completely invaluable when it comes to getting us back to doing these things for the right reasons at the right scales again.
Mhm. Great, thank you so much. Um, there's a piece that I read that you had written in 2020, and it was called "Our Land Was Taken, but We Still Hold the Knowledge of How to Stop Mega Fires," which of course is a huge problem. For those who are interested, this piece was also recently republished, which is where I read it in Charm Miller's new book, Burn Scars. What can you tell us about the challenges of mega fires and also the benefits of what you call good fire? And what are some of the challenges that you're facing today as you work with fire in communities to manage forests and ecosystems and really to bring back good fires?
Well, that's I believe that was that article was something that I had done in collaboration with some folks, some media folks, and I can't remember where it was originally published. I think it was in the Guardian. But I mean, we were experiencing, we've been experiencing mega fires in our area for a long time. It's like we've got the 87 fires, we've got the 94 fires, and then it's just, before that we had the, 73 and other, large scale events, and that were completely stand replacing, and so these are areas that had fire excluded, for quite some time. And so
Mhm.
now we're getting to the point to where so much fuel has built up out there that and then you combine that with the extreme weather events that we're seeing today, and and it's just the outcomes of these events are just moving so fast, and they're just completely devastating. And they're burning up entire herds of deer and elk, and spotted owl habitat,
Mhm.
and all these things. It's like, sure, there are other species that benefit from having some stand replacing fire out there, but the scale that we're seeing it is going to take quite a bit to recover from. And like I believe that original story, was in response to the 2020 Slater fire,
Mhm.
and so it that burned about 112,000 acres, in the first burn period. And it just, it started, by an electrical um, ignition in a power line corridor, and lightning doesn't start fires when you have a northeast wind event. It just simply doesn't happen in nature. But these electrical infrastructure fires are happening when you have those high winds, and so
Mhm.
so that is not a natural process. That is not a natural outcome. Typically when you have a lightning start, um, you've got some kind of a cold front moisture coming through, and your winds are coming from a different direction, and so by the time that wind shifts and you do get that northeast wind event, it's got some kind of it's kind of at least partially blowing back against itself,
Mm-hmm.
and has some degree of mitigation against that type of an outcome at that scale. So, and then if you can combine that with patchworks of frequent fire regime, a mosaic of frequent fire regimes, embers are still going to land out there, but and a lot will start more fires, but can they all come together at once into this just massive flame front? It's at a certain level, multiple fires out there will confuse each other. But if
Mm-hmm.
there's enough fuel there to where it can all come together and just go, then it's just spotting, blowing up, spotting, blowing up, and you get this what's called mass area ignition, that just goes over and over and over again until those conditions kind of change. And so, we're losing entire communities. We lost half the homes in Happy Camp that year. And it's devastating.
Yeah.
The the interesting part is that what you see coming back and resprouting in those areas are the hardwoods, and shade intolerant species,
Mm-hmm.
that are more conducive of a indigenous fire regime. And so, so that provides an opportunity. And so, if we can get back in and we can reemploy these indigenous fire regimes on those places that are between our communities, or where our village places are, and those, it's basically those southwest slopes that have the hottest, driest, sun exposure. Those are the slopes that a northeast wind events are going to be blowing right down into your community. And so having those, turned back into black oak woodland, is going to be critical, or else these places are just going to burn again. And so you see things like ceanothus coming back in. Ceanothus is a nitrogen fixer. But we're seeing it at massive scales, and it only takes about 7 years to get to 50% dead to live ratio. But those fuels are perched off the ground, and so the only thing that's really going to move fire through those fuels is wind.
Mm-hmm.
So, thinking that we're going to break up the way fire behaves on that landscape by creating a burn unit and cutting a fire line and doing all this intensive work, is to some degree unreasonable, when we should be doing pre-treatments to protect those deciduous trees, and those trees that we want to come back, and then using those southwest wind events when a season-ending event's coming, and light it and let it go to the break and slope and just take out a swath of that dead fuel that's perched.
Mm-hmm.
And we really have to start getting to those kind of practices, or we're not going to be able to. Those places will burn over and over again.
Yeah. And I think, in Charmiller's book too, he brings in historical documents that really show how there was such a concerted federal effort to suppress and exclude all fire, and preventing indigenous communities from burning, and also being very critical of people of European descent, who said that there is ecological knowledge, there's a benefit to doing it. So there really are, article after article in that book of kind of the history of Europeans coming and wanting to suppress those fire practices. And I hear in what you're saying just the pain of that and the repercussions of that policy that's with us today still.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first laws created in California, was the Act for the Governance and Protection of Indians. Um, ultimately that authorized, enslavement, and criminalized, fire use practices. And so, The statement the governor made, first governor of California made at the time, was that to make no mistake, this is a war of extermination that we're waging here, and they're not going to stop till every last one of us is wiped out. And so it's like that's part of the intent behind all these things. Now that law was repealed eventually in its entirety, but in our area, we didn't really see, a lot of people kept burning, and a lot of the settlers that came in kept burning, maybe for different reasons, up until the point of the passage of the Weeks Act. A lot of people say, well, I thought the Weeks Act was about buying land in the East and turning it into national
Mhm.
forest. And it's like, yeah, it was, but the Western governors wouldn't support it, unless there was a provision that enabled coordination on wildland fire management programs. And so that's when the Forest Service started to kind of come in and change their approach, to coming in and basically shooting at people and killing them for burning. And so it was that coordination between the federal and states, and so that ultimately changed. And the last time we burned off Field Mountain for our world renewal ceremonies was 1911, and after that it was just one of those known things. And so it happens this time of year every year, and so they knew where to be to stop it.
Yeah. And that was the year of the Weeks Act, right? 1911.
Yep. And so, now we're coming full circle, and we're getting into a new era of shared stewardship, and so it's really going to take, all of us, and it's going to take that same coordination between states and feds and tribes and local communities and academic institutions. It's going to take all of us, because this is a monumental task we're faced with.
Yeah.
And
And I think that's exactly what's so important about the work that you're doing now, is that you are collaborating with lots of different communities, with your tribal members, with local communities, with federal community. You're really reaching out to different stakeholders. I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about some of the successes you've had doing this kind of work and what some of the remaining challenges are of those kinds of collaborations.
yeah, well, I mean, we've been trying to demonstrate, what we can and should be doing here for, the better part of, 30 some odd years. But more recently, it's, we've been, getting to the point where we are all working together, and, things like the, Indigenous Peoples Burning Network and Western Climate Restoration Partnership, have been really instrumental, in pulling people together, and identifying problems, and constructing solutions around the shared values that we can identify together. And so it's we've got to the point to where, we're fully integrated into the program of work on Six Rivers National Forests, and we're, we're writing the NEPA documents together. We're managing, through partnership, we're managing any kind of the timber contracts. We're, avoiding lawsuits, for in project planning processes, and we're having, partners that would have normally litigated, over maybe a diameter limit or something like that, or a spotted owl habitat or something like that, saying, well, wait a minute, if we're going to protect this habitat, we have to take some of these trees out to protect these oaks, that are getting shaded out. And so we've been able to demonstrate those things, that there are shared values out there, and we can start to scale this up to be completed at meaningful scales. And then more recently, some of those barriers have kind of been around. There's this there's this idea that humans are separate from nature,
Mhm.
and we're not. We are a species on this landscape, just like the wildlife and the plants that are out there, and we have a niche that we fill in the ecosystem, and and so that responsibility around the use of fire is that niche, and so, so being able to employ indigenous fire management practices, is not considered natural. It's considered anthropogenic, and
Mhm.
therefore it's subject to regulation. And so, that regulation forces us to do things at riskier times or inappropriate times. And so, things like the Clean Air Act, they're very very important. We want to protect human health. We want to not have red skies in San Francisco from the way fires are behaving today. But we also have to burn grass at night in late June. And right now, it's hard to do that. If you burn it in the day, because the regulation says you have to stop by 6 p.m., then by the time you get everyone mobilized and actually get things started, you're moving out of prescription because your afternoon winds are coming up, and you're trying to start something at the very worst time of day. And so that leads to escapes, which then leads to public outcry and distrust. And so we've managed to overcome some of those hurdles and demonstrate that, well, we can wait until those winds die down, and we can burn at night when humidities start coming up,
Mhm.
and we can have great outcomes in those grasses at that time of year, and not have escapes.
Mhm.
And so, but people don't tend to believe things till they see things.
Mhm.
And so we've been successful in demonstrating some of that to the point to where trust has been built, and more recently, one of the major successes is the passage of SB 310, with the help of Senator Dodd's office, and working with the California Natural Resources Agency and others, and so we've here in the last couple months, we've signed the first agreement under that new authority in California.
And can you
And
just give us a real quick kind of high level of what the legislation said?
yeah, the legislation established an authority for the Natural Resources Agency and local air districts to enter into agreements with tribes, to be able to have an agreements in lieu of permits process that is respective of tribal sovereignty. And so yeah, we've been kind of demonstrating that. We've got about between 30 to 50, acres, burned off in, the sunniest, most exposed, driest fuels in and around our community, just in this last month or so. So it's something that we're going to be having a webinar on more specifically here, on April 1st, I believe, and then we're having a training in Sacramento for tribes that want to enter into these agreements on the 3rd. So hopefully that'll start rolling out, and we'll be able to have more folks
Mhm.
be able to burn under their traditional principles and practices.
Congratulations on getting that passed as well. Well, I could keep going, but I see that there's a lot of questions coming in on the Q&A. So I'm going to thank you so much, Bill, and I'm going to go offline and hand it over to Gary, who's going to field the Q&A from our audience. Good talking to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Tania. And Bill, it's great to see you. Welcome again. Thank you for having this conversation with us. Fascinating listening to you talk about the issues that you work with. and understand from your perspective. Couple that we do have, as Tanya said, there are a bunch of questions that are coming in. So if we could just jump in on those, is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. One thing that I think would be helpful to the audience that's tuning in is to understand a bit more about what would be considered the traditional territory of the Karuk, the territory that the Karuk would use the most to engage with, to food, shelter, and all the things that you engage with in your landscape. To describe that traditionally and maybe compare that or juxtapose that to the land that you have immediate access and rights over now.
Okay. Well, there's a couple of things. The Karuk tribe's constitution clearly establishes the tribal jurisdiction. Just like any other sovereign nation's constitution would, so that constitution defines our jurisdiction over a 1 point it's just a little over 1 million acre Aboriginal territory, plus whatever other lands that the tribe owns or subsequently acquires outside of that territory. 98% of our Aboriginal territory is National Forest System lands, and so in our view, we have a concurrent jurisdiction with the United States Forest Service. 2% of that landscape is tribal trust and or private property, and so then that establishes a further concurrent jurisdiction when it comes to state responsibility areas, say over fire for private lands, as well as jurisdictions associated with the Bureau of Indian Affairs on the trust lands, and so that's kind of the foundation for the coordination amongst entities, governance entities as an intergovernmental process. And so, but the things with like the SB 310 agreement considered additional factors. Now, the tribe has a service area that includes all of Siskiyou County. There are other tribes in Siskiyou County, and so when it came to the fact that we do have trust lands and we do have resources affected that go out beyond the scope of that Aboriginal territory, we wanted to make sure that we were able to help other folks, not only protect those lands that we own outside and manage exclusively outside of that territory, but to help other people, get to this point to where they can effectively utilize SB 310 as well, and we can go help them in that process. And so the SB 310 agreement is applicable to the entirety of the Karuk Aboriginal Territory and Siskiyou County. That way, that can help us hopefully establish some meaningful partnerships throughout and work with PBAs, work with other tribes, work with community members to be able to, to get started, and hopefully people of those places can start to take care of these things on their own.
Okay. Another person had asked Bill, they're very curious about what the landscape and what the forests and surrounding areas that surround your tribe and the villages. Could you describe that landscape to us so we understand the composition or makeup or in any way that you can describe the makeup of the forest?
Yeah, so I don't know. This we're located in the extreme corner of northwestern California. Our Aboriginal territory goes a little bit into Oregon, up in the headwaters, around the headwaters of Indian Creek, and so it's our territory is kind of surrounded by multiple wilderness areas. We've got the Shasta Trinity on one side. We've got, the Russian wilderness up there, and then the Siskiyou wilderness and the Marble Mountain wilderness right in the heart of our territory. And so having all these wilderness areas, it's extremely wild, I guess, in nature. It's one of the most ecological diverse places on the planet. There's a place up Salmon River country there where there's 17 different conifer species in 1 square mile. A lot of the area in and around our villages would kind of be classified as a mixed evergreen forest in that low to mid elevation. Now that determination, those things were defined after a significant era of conifer encroachment and fire exclusion. So, a good portion of that should probably have a different classification, especially on those high insulation slopes, where it should be more of a, deciduous species dominance. And so yeah, I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but there's not a lot of the communities are pretty small. I mean the town I grew up in has a population of about 150 people. The town of Orleans here is maybe 650 people. I mean there's not a lot of people in these communities, but there are 7 distinct communities throughout our territory where there's concentrations of people living.
Okay. Jumping in with some of the questions from the audience, James, and so this relates to your description of the landscape. James asks, when you mentioned that oaks were being shaded out. James is just curious what was out competing them, and I would add, so from a cultural perspective or other reason, you would favor oaks in that landscape. Is that right? So what's shading them that out, and why oaks?
Well, Douglas fir is shading out the black oak and white oak kind of components. And so that's, typically on your southerly slopes, it's where the sun shines down the most intensely. And so at the low to mid elevation scale. Now on the north aspects, tan oak is one of those true mixed evergreen type of species that would be mixed in well with Douglas fir. And so when you look at things like spotted owl habitat, one of the under discussed habitat criteria for a spotted owl is thermal refugia, which you would find on those northerly aspects. And so where you have, this multi-layer canopy, you need the tan oak and the conifer, and you know what I mean, to have that multi-layer, multi-species canopy with an open understory. And so to have an open understory, you have to be gathering acorns. You have to be burning on those places to keep that open understory. On the south side, a lot of conifers have encroached, where we would have had a lot more grasslands and a lot more oak dominated stands. And so the oak has been disappearing, and the grasslands have been disappearing. And so that's 2 key burn windows in February and March, and in late June, we don't burn during a very distinct window of time that has an indicator set that we watch for in that April, May, June window. We don't use that's when things are reproducing, and we don't use fire for anything but heating and cooking in that time. But late June and February, March is important for those. There's a point in time there, like with the bumblebees now, facing listing in the Endangered Species Act, and so that queen bee, at least in that species that's living in the oak woodlands, goes underneath of the duff and overwinters. They come out when the manzanita, another shade intolerant species that's disappearing, is blooming. And so, when that manzanita blooms and that bumblebee comes out of the duff, there's a window where those oak leaves will burn. And so not only can you burn off the top layer of those leaves, you can scorch off the hazel, you can do all these other things and enhance all these other resources and promote more flowers to come in and bloom in that reproductive cycle. So then there is access to more pollen for the or nectar or whatever for the for those bumblebees to help ensure they have a successful reproductive cycle. And so the practice is, help with these things, right?
Right.
And so it's yeah, if we don't have those conditions on the landscape, we can't help, and those species inevitably start to disappear. And so, focusing on those species that are reflected in our ceremonies and our stories, and focusing in on relearning from them what we need to do, and just getting out there and doing it and restoring those conditions conducive of having those indigenous fire regimes put back into place is what we're working on.
Okay. Will asks, for people that have not grown up with fire and have a great fear of it, how do you try to help them overcome those fears? You had mentioned before that obviously a lot of people are worried about cultural burning because they don't understand it and or they have been taught to fear fire. So how do you approach that?
The only real way to approach that is to immerse people in it. Like I said earlier, seeing is believing. We were burning up along the road, along the highway here a few weeks back up in Somes, and we were burning off every little piece along that roadway that would burn, and so being able to do things like that, and when people come and stop and say, "Hey, what are you doing?" You know what I mean? It's like we don't have cell service around here, so they can't just automatically dial 911. So we tell the store, it's like, "Hey, have them come talk to us if they have questions," and we let them know what we're doing so they can tell people what they're doing and or what folks are doing, and when people see that you can light a patch that's in the sun and it goes out as it moves into the shade, and it does, it cleans up underneath the power line, and it cleans up along the edge of the road where dragging chains are starting fires, and in the worst times of year. Those are the types of things that will resonate with people, and it'll click, and it's like, oh, I didn't think about that. You know what I mean? And so I don't know how we get to the point of changing Smokey Bear's message. That's starting to happen. That's one of the most effective public education campaigns in perhaps global history. And so we're starting to get to the point to where Smokey's message can change too, because that is ultimately where that fear starts. You teach kids how to be afraid when they're young, And when you establish a principle in someone when they're young, it's hard to change. And so that's the distinction between how I was raised and how others throughout the United States are raised in this question is that people are just taught to believe fire is bad. And it takes a lot before people start to see otherwise. Whereas if we can start to teach there's a right way, and really the right way is the only way we're going to protect ourselves and prevent these massively negative consequences. I mean, that's what we need to start doing in a lot more places.
Okay. Let's see if we can get one or two more in. Definitely can get one more in. So Marty asked, how do you balance desire to preserve or get back to historical habitat with the changes that are coming due to climate change and the changing climate?
Yeah, so it's a matter of time before before an ignition aligns with the wind event and a community, right? And so what we've done is what we're doing is we're starting in and around the community, and we're making it to where we can rebuild frequent fire regimes there. Our communities want it. The biggest issue becomes smoke for sensitive receptors, and so we give people HEPA filters if that's a concern, and people seem to be pretty happy with that. People are tired of the smoke from the wildfires, and so once we get to the point of having that that community kind of strengthened and hardened in a way to where we can start to get some larger scale burns out there on the ground, then that's what we're doing next. And that's a phase we're at now, is doing this 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 acre projects. But ultimately, one of the most important things we can do right now in our area is to restore black oak woodlands on southwest slopes, and restore those frequent fire regimes associated with those, because that's where the wind is going to drive it right into your community. And so yeah, I mean, it's going to take a whole lot of things out there to do, including thinning around existing oak trees and maybe even planting some oak trees. I don't know. The blue jay typically will come in when there's a good spot for an oak tree, and they'll plant an acorn. They're really, really good at that. And so yeah, I mean, restoring those oak woodlands is going to be one of the best things we can do in our area right now in this time. Now every place out there is going to be different. They have different species assemblages, and it's going to be up to people to kind of key in on these cues and figure out what right looks like in that place.
All right, Bill, let's try to get one more in. We started a few minutes late, so maybe we can take a few more minutes. This is a great question, and it might not be easy to answer quickly, but let's see what you think. We have a question related to what do you need to do to continue to build up your ability to do cultural burning, traditional practice, and programs around that? What are some of the aspects that you would like or need to be able to realize what you would see as a healthy cultural burning regime?
Well, I mean, we need to train more people on the principles and practices of, how to do this as individuals and families and neighborhoods. And, if we end up being dependent on the professional workforce that has NWCG trainings and all these things, we're going to need those folks to do the more complex more technical burning that is restoring conditions conducive of doing these things in a safe and efficient manner. And so, as a community of practice, and so, whether it's a cultural fire practitioners or whether it's, prescribed burn associations or even some kind of just a community, a neighborhood burn team, whatever this turns into, we need to get people, knowing when, where, and how, and why to do these things. And we need people to get the experience in it so the trust can be managed. Now, one of the biggest hurdles out there are the way that the air quality regulations are structured, and I think that if there was one key regulatory hurdle, that would be it. Now, when you look at things like the exceptional events rule, it says that prescribed fires can be done, but you have to go through this whole process that sometimes can take decades of identifying what the fire regimes are and doing this, doing that. You should be able to do that with your local indigenous knowledge systems, and just start that and get a jump start on that. When it comes to things like fireworks displays, those are already exempt. They don't have to go through a big process for being qualified as an exceptional event. If there is an exceedance of the air quality standards, and it's just an automatic thing that can be done due to their national, historic, and cultural significance. Now, why isn't indigenous burning and human use of fire that is aligned with that's natural to place? Indigenous means natural to place, and so if you can align with those indigenous regimes that aren't necessarily documented, so you can't build a plan that's going to get it right, without going through 10, 20 years of work to get there, and by then it's going to be too late. So it's just some things like that are going to be important to address moving forward.
All right. Thanks for that, Bill. That's a lot to think about. And let's hope that things move in that direction. Thank you again for chatting with us. I know I've learned a lot, and I think our audience would agree with me on that. So appreciate it. We appreciate the time that you took to be with us. So join us next week when our speaker will be Mohan Kumar, and Mohan is the is the chairman of the Research Council at the Coralia Forest Research Institute. And Mohan's talk is titled "From Vedic Pedigrees to Recent Times: India's Forestry Traditions." So please join us next week